Good evening and welcome. As the university's provost, I am often struck by the variety of ways in which our remarkable Columbia faculty contribute to society. Some reshape doctrinal thinking and influence the frontiers of scholarship. Others pursue the new knowledge that will help the world come to grips with urgent and very real problems. And then there are those whose academic creativity is leading to new, hybrid fields of study. And of course, so many illuminate the classroom with their brilliance, providing Columbia students with unforgettable learning experiences. In Mae M, we have a member of the Columbia faculty who is a one-woman exemplar of all of these impressive talents. She well deserves the honor of giving the university lecture, and her standard of excellence in turn pays tribute to the many shining lights of Columbia who have preceded her at this podium on nights like this. Mae M is Columbia's Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History. Her pioneering scholarship has succeeded in deepening our understanding of the historic experience of America's immigrants, while at the same time bringing much needed perspective to the unforgiving political debate that exists today over U.S. immigration policy. Her very first book, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, garnered praise and awards and has become required reading on the issue of immigration in America. A more recent volume, The Lucky Ones, explores the impact of exclusionism on the Chinese diaspora by chronicling the journey of a family who rose to middle-class distinction. In the great tradition of public intellectuals at Columbia, Professor Ngai often shares her insights about current events on the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications for general audiences. In 2009, she convened a notable conference at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington that brought together scholars, journalists, policy analysts, and advocates to discuss how to repair America's broken immigration system. A current exhibit at the New York Historical Society called Chinese American Exclusion Inclusion bears her imprint as well. I hope tonight's lecture may inspire some of you to go and see it. The exhibit runs until April 19th and is just 5 short stops away on the number 1 train. The thread unifying all this work is a prevailing empathy combined with formidable scholarly analysis. Professor Ngai has a gift for describing the lives of people whose stories often go untold, and in her telling, she makes clear to us that their experience is inseparable from the American story. Always, Professor Ngai's commitment to social justice informs and enhances her work. Tonight, she will focus on the so-called Chinese question that was being posed in many nations of the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a time when railroads and mining development drove Chinese miners to California, Mexico, Peru, Australia, and South Africa, and conflicts born of racial difference were coming to the fore in many places. As you will hear, this history provides an essential window into current discussions of large-scale immigration and the relationship between local communities and our modern global society. I want to close this introduction on a slightly more personal note. Professor Ngai, you should know, is a true Columbian in both spirit and lineage. She grew up not far from here, across the river in Teaneck, New Jersey, where her passion for equality and justice was fanned by the civil rights movement and Vietnam War protests. As a young woman, she taught English as a second language to members of the United Auto Workers local union. She received her master's and PhD in history here at Columbia, graduating with distinction. And both of her parents, Dr. Shihuan Ngai and Dr. Shuihua Wang, were distinguished faculty members at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. The Ngai's family connection with Columbia reaches back to 1949. Tonight, we are very pleased that Mae becomes the first member of her accomplished family to present the university lecture. Please join me in welcoming Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and of History, Mae Ngai.
Thank you, Professor Provost Coatsworth, and thank all of you for coming this evening. It's a great honor for me to be here. I want to start with a little confession. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was bitten by the transnational bug. The research demands of working across national boundaries are daunting. Indeed, here I am 7 or 8 years later and not yet finished with this book. But I'm also encouraged by the new angles and insights that transnational research affords. So I'm very excited to be here tonight and to have this opportunity to share with you some of my findings. Around the turn of the last century, some half-dozen countries enacted laws that prohibited Chinese immigration. These countries constituted an arc that ranged from the Americas across the Pacific to Australasia, and then across the Indian Ocean to South Africa. The late political scientist Aristide Zolberg called it the Great Wall against China. The conventional explanation for Chinese exclusion is that Euro-American workers in the receiving countries feared competition from cheap Chinese labor. And indeed, this perception was widespread. But there was something special, something more about the Chinese question that emerged in the late 19th century. It carried an unmistakable whiff of racism, and it appeared to be a global problem. But how Chinese immigration became a global race problem has not been adequately explained. At one level, we might note the obvious, that global ideas emerge in a global environment. And to be sure, the period between 1875 and the First World War was one of unprecedented global integration, achieved through the increased circulation of people, capital, trade, and ideas. But we might pause and ask, why do some ideas become global and not others? How do ideas acquire global force? There were, of course, general stereotypes about China that circulated in the West since the early 19th century. Orientalist constructions about the stagnation and despotism of the East, which served to define the progress and vigor of the West, perhaps most famously expressed by Hegel in his Lectures on the Philosophy of History, published in 1805. But in the late 19th century, these ideas were too general, too vague to have political force on the ground. In important ways, the local was the generative site of politics, to paraphrase Tip O'Neill's famous dictum. But politics also travel, as it were, and borrow from and copy the ideas and policies of others. There's a dynamic interplay between the local and the global, and it is this relationship that interests me. I should also note that what appears here as the global Chinese question was more precisely a phenomenon of the Anglo-American world. This directs our attention, then, to a more specific question about the role of Chinese exclusion in the trajectories of British and American power in the late 19th and early 20th century. I begin with the gold rushes because they were the first occasion of large-scale contact between Euro-Americans and Chinese, and that contact took place in the context of the globalization of trade, credit, and labor. In the span of 50 years, more gold was extracted from the earth than in the previous 3,000. The economic historian Jean-Jacques Van Helten considered the increase in the global supply of gold in the late 19th century a fortuitous meeting of the monetary demands posed by expanding world trade. But we might think of it more as a stimulus, a new stage of capital accumulation, which made possible that expansion, and in particular the rise of Great Britain and the United States as the world's leading investor and creditor nations. The gold rushes also launched into motion hundreds of thousands of people from the British Isles, continental Europe, the Americas, Australasia, and China. In California and the Australian colony of Victoria, Chinese comprised upwards of 25% of the mining population in the 1850s and 60s. The gold fields were fluid international contact zones on the frontiers of the world's core societies. Many miners were serial rushers, but others settled down and became idealized by their descendants for their democratic and entrepreneurial spirit. They marked the advent of settler colonialism, which congealed the frontier, to paraphrase historian Jürgen Ostenhammel. Without exception, these polities excluded the Chinese. Most studies on the Chinese exclusion movements are country-specific. A few are transnational and comparative, dealing variously with white labor politics, elite national discourse, or passport controls. But they all tend to view anti-Chinese racism as a homogeneous global idea. In my research, I have been struck by the differences in the Chinese question on the ground, especially during the gold rush period. The global Chinese question did not emerge fully formed like Hera from Zeus's head. It shifted and evolved as it moved across and shaped the Pacific world. What follows, then, is a travelogue of the Chinese question as an idea or a set of ideas which over the course of several decades acquired the status and force of a global idea, and the role of that idea in the rise of Anglo-American hegemony. We start in California, where the discovery of gold on the North Fork of the American River in January of 1848 drew prospectors from the eastern and southern United States, from Hawaii, Mexico and Chile, Great Britain and Europe, Australia and China. In the early fevered days of the rush, white Americans found nativism a convenient weapon of competition. It's all for us, not for you, a crude expression of American manifest destiny. By 1850, they had already successfully driven from the gold fields Mexicans, South Americans, and many Europeans, excepting only those from the British Isles and Germany, whom they regarded as their ethnic kin. Anti-foreign sentiment then zeroed in on the Chinese, who were just arriving in large numbers. The Chinese also arrived at a time when placer mining, that is, the sifting of gold in the gravel of riverbeds, was beginning to give out, so anti-foreign feeling now mixed with the bitterness of dashed hopes. In 1852, the argument against Chinese took on a special cast, with white Americans now accusing them of being indentured workers or coolies, imagined as slaves and semi-slaves. In fact, Chinese workers worked in a variety of ways, least of which was under contract. They worked mostly as independent prospectors and in small cooperative groups, as well as for wages for white-owned companies, practices that were common among miners across ethnic lines. But if Chinese were not actually indentured, the larger fiction that they were a coolie race overwhelmed any inconvenience of fact. Anti-coolieism imagined Chinese as innately servile, without individual personality or will, regardless of their actual condition. It was a racial shorthand that drew on two comparisons. First, it recalled the so-called coolie trade of indentured Asian labor to the former slave plantation colonies. And second, and much closer to home, it associated Chinese with African slavery in the American South. That second association positioned Chinese immediately as a racial threat to free labor. The coolie trope was actually not invented on the gold fields, but in Sacramento as a weapon in the first chapter of California state politics. As early as 1850, some California elites were promoting grandiose visions of developing a new empire along the Pacific slope, one that potentially stretched from Alaska to Chile. They saw Chinese labor as the key to this development, labor they believed to be in unlimited supply, and at this time, before the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, more readily accessible than labor from east of the Rockies. In January of 1852, a state senator named George Tingley introduced legislation that would enable the recruitment of foreign workers to develop timbering, agriculture, and mining. Opponents dubbed it the Coolie Bill and immediately quashed it. The bill never got out of committee. Months later, however, Governor John Bigler, referring to the bill, gave an incendiary speech that claimed the state was already being overwhelmed by the immigration of unfree Chinese coolies. Bigler, who was running for re-election, was the first American politician to use the Chinese question to build an electoral base. His speech gave white miners license to attack Chinese and their property, and it provided an ideological theme that rallied and sustained a movement for exclusion. Within weeks of his speech, miners in Columbia, Tuolumne County, met and voted to exclude Chinese from mining in their district. The resolution railed against those who would flood the state with degraded Asiatics and fasten, without sanction of law, the system of peonage on our social organization. Across the state, miners' assemblies passed anti-Chinese resolutions bidding them to leave, or, more pragmatically, forbidding them from first ownership of claims, which enabled whites to sell their worked-over claims when they left to chase another gold strike. Racist theories about Chinese labor continued as the nature of gold mining changed, as the placers diminished and mining shifted to highly capitalized underground hard rock mining, also known as quartz mining. Both whites and Chinese worked for the big mining companies for wages. Contemporary observers noted that brawny pigtail wearers worked in the deep mines at Mariposa, shoulder to shoulder with Cornish miners. But Chinese also persisted in independent mining. The solidarities of their hometown associations and brotherhood societies sustained their cooperative ventures. Chinese egalitarian cooperatives might also be understood as a refuge from capitalist wage relations. White miners did not have analogous cultural resources to resist the turn to wage labor. When industrial mining came to dominate the scene, independent white prospectors traded their autonomy for the relative security of a job, or they quit mining altogether. The use of Chinese gang labor, first seen in the construction of mining infrastructures and later in building the railroad, further confirmed whites' beliefs that Chinese were held in bondage. In fact, ethnic gang labor can be traced to the contracting of Irish workers to dig canals in northern states from the building of the Erie Canal from the late 1810s through the 1840s. In the antebellum North, contemporaries considered Irish workers to be rough and intemperate, but they didn't accuse them of being slaves, which they obviously were not. But after the Civil War, contracted labor assumed an ambiguous place in American political culture, which had drawn a bright line between servitude and slavery on the one hand and free labor on the other. As labor came increasingly to mean waged work and not independent farming or artisanship, drawing a line against contracted ethnic labor was a way for white workers to address their own sense of precarity. The association of ethnic and racial others with unfreedom enabled that construction, which otherwise was not so clear-cut. Indeed, race obfuscated the ambiguities in concepts such as free labor, voluntary migration, and especially the contract. As freedom of contract became the watchword of free labor under laissez-faire capital, the contract remained associated with indenture and servility for the Chinese. Anti-coolieism remained foundational in the 1870s and 1880s as the urban workingmen's movement and state party politics drove the Chinese question to national exclusion legislation in 1882. In Australia, conditions were similar to those in the American West. An international rush following the discovery of placer deposits in 1854, followed by a shift to capitalized quartz mining. As in California, Chinese miners engaged in independent prospecting, small companies and egalitarian cooperatives, and waged work for European-owned companies. They also organized themselves into the same hometown associations and brotherhood societies that were common across the Chinese diaspora. Racism against Chinese on the Australian goldfields was more inchoate than in California. There was racial tension and conflict, and a few anti-Chinese riots, some of which seemed to have been instigated by Americans. But white miners aimed their ire chiefly at the colonial government, which required an expensive miner's license and policed the goldfields to enforce compliance. California was more like a free-for-all. Although many Europeans disdained the Chinese, they did not allege that the Chinese were indentured or enslaved. The legacy of unfreedom in the Australian colonies was not racialized African slavery, but convict transportation of the English and Irish poor. More important in their perceptions of Chinese were fears generated by their location at the fringes of the British Empire. The Melbourne Argus explained, Geographically, we are nearer the pent-up millions of China than any other large tract of country occupied by the white man. We are still but a handful of men and women and children. Australians obsessed over their fragile hold on the continent and their vulnerability in a larger contest in Asia between the two empires, Britain and China. In Victoria, anti-Chinese agitation clashed with official colonial policy of equal protection. In principle, this principle, enshrined in precepts of Enlightenment liberalism, was a conceit belied by Britain's vast empire acquired through violence and dispossession. In general, Victoria conceded to and protected European interests. But the colonial government did oppose individual and group violence against Chinese. Police were more likely to arrest and prosecute Europeans who committed crimes against Chinese in Victoria than in California. It is also worth noting that, unlike California, Chinese and European miners continued to work their claims side by side in the gullies, and some Chinese married European women and started families. The coolie trope did not enter Australian politics until the late 1870s and 1880s, and it came not from the goldfields of Victoria or New South Wales, but from the so-called top end, where controversy grew over the use of Asian and Pacific Island contract labor in Queensland and the Northern Territory. White Australians had conceded the use of colored labor in the tropical far north, where, as one observer put it, white men fell victim to malaria and fever under the fierce sun and amid the marshes. Now, we know, right, that this climate theory of race is spurious because enslaved people also suffered from tropical diseases, not to mention plantation labor. But in any event, the problem in Australia was that the tropical areas were not separate islands like Jamaica or Mauritius, but were contiguous to the temperate zones which Europeans had staked out for themselves. By the late 1870s and 80s, whites in Australia were becoming increasingly alarmed at the growth and mobility of the Chinese population in the far north. The Queensland Worker targeted the pastoralists, the colony's most powerful capitalists, for their, quote, determination to make Queensland and Australia as much like Fiji and Hindustan as possible. The Chinese question became a core element of an emergent Australian nationalism which viewed racial homogeneity and free labor as conditions for democracy. This was a new ideological formation, forcefully masculinist and racial. Anti-Chinese leagues sprang up in big cities like Melbourne and Sydney, even though the Chinese urban population was tiny and economic competition was negligible. In 1878, the Seamen's Union struck the Australian Steam Navigation Company to protest the use of Chinese sailors on its vessels, a reminder of the racial stakes in the Pacific world. References in the Australian press to the California exclusion movement were frequent and explicit. Newspapers reported regularly the speeches of Dennis Kearney, San Francisco's notorious sandlot orator. Many made direct comparisons between the ruinous effect of Chinese immigration in California and Australia. By the 1880s and 90s, most of the Australian colonies had enacted some restriction on Chinese immigration. Still, British imperial policy prohibited categorical exclusion. The historian Benjamin Mountford has argued that the Chinese question in Australia was really two questions involving different interests: a colonial or local question about immigration and an imperial question about British commerce and diplomacy with China. In the 1880s and 90s, these two questions became increasingly at odds, straining both Anglo-Australian relations and Sino-British relations. It was only with federation and self-government in 1901 that white Australia came fully into its own. The new parliament quickly passed legislation that excluded Asian immigration, as well as laws to deport Pacific Islanders and exclude Aboriginal peoples from the franchise. Just a few years after Australian Federation, in 1904, Chinese began to go to the British colony of Transvaal in South Africa to work in the gold mines on the Witwatersrand, which was and still is the largest producer of gold in the world. Between 1904 and 1910, the Transvaal Chamber of Mines imported over 60,000 Chinese for work on the Rand. This novel experiment was aimed at reviving the gold industry and addressing the shortage of native labor after the South African War. It was also a ticking political time bomb in the post-war context, as South Africa's racial politics were still in flux. That is, it remained unresolved what would be the basis of reconciliation between the whites, the British, and the Afrikaners, and what would be the policy toward the native Africans. Unlike Chinese miners to North America and Australia, the Chinese mine laborers who went to the Rand went under contracts that set their wages and hours, forbade them from working in any other occupation or industry, and from owning or leasing property, and required them to return to China at the conclusion of their contract. But if Chinese mining laborers were indentured, they were not docile. They rioted, went on strike, deserted the mines, and passively resisted by simply refusing to drill more than the daily minimum number of inches required of them. Within 6 months, the program faced a crisis of labor discipline and social control. Soon the problem became quite larger than the specific demands of the mine labor program. There were sensational accounts in the Transvaal about Chinese mine deserters roaming the countryside and attacking Afrikaner farmsteads, and in Great Britain about floggings and other conditions alleged to be akin to slavery. The crisis assumed the incendiary symbolic force of the Chinese question, building upon a half-century of European experience with Chinese immigration to New World settlements. Not coincidentally, the white English-speaking skilled miners and artisans in Transvaal included many Australian and Cornish workers. The Australians, who dominated the leadership of the trade unions, were direct carriers of anti-Asiatic labor politics. For example, the president of the Witwatersrand Trade and Labor Council, Peter Whiteside, was originally from Ballarat, Australia. And Tom Matthews, who founded the Miners' Association on the Rand, was a Cornish miner who came to South Africa by way of Montana, where he had been a miner and a socialist state legislator. The Chinese question on the Rand emerged as a key issue in two major political elections in 1906, the general elections in Britain and the elections for responsible government or home rule in Transvaal. Both elections brought new parties to power that spelled the speedy demise of the Chinese labor program and set broader trajectories into motion. In Transvaal, the Afrikaner Het Volk Party, led by the former Boer commandos Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, rode the Chinese question to power, setting the course that would lead the colonies to federate as the Union of South Africa in 1910 under the banner of radical white supremacy and racial segregation. South Africa joined Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as self-governing dominions of the British Empire, all based on white settler rule, native dispossession, and Asiatic exclusion. In Britain, the Chinese question helped the Labour Party overturn 20 years of nearly unbroken conservative rule in 1906 and galvanized the British trade unions to form an independent Labour Party, which would soon eclipse its Liberal ally as the main opposition to the Tories. A new angle of white labor interests came to the fore in the framing of the Chinese question. The trade unions used the moral capital of anti-slavery in its rhetoric, but it would be fairer to say that they were discontinuous with British abolitionist tradition. Only the British Anti-Slavery Society took a principled anti-racist position. That is, it opposed the system of indenture while supporting free Chinese immigration. British labor, however, like their cousins in the Dominions, and they were quite often literally cousins, believed the settler colonies were for British immigration and not for anyone else. Some scholars have associated these politics with an emergent imperial white working class in which white workers across the Anglo-American world called upon their governments to protect them from both capital and from the colored races. In the colonies, white labor gave popular support to elite political interests, which in a sense were rather parochial insofar as they sought power in their particular node of the empire. The Chinese question gave them a common cause and a global stage. For Great Britain, white settler autonomy was the price of developing Australia and South Africa inside the empire and not, like the United States, outside of it, as famously said by Lord Selborne, Chamberlain's Undersecretary and later the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa. The Dominions got to have their cake and eat it too. They would be self-governing, but they would still have the empire's protection from the proximate threats of the Yellow Peril and Black Africa. Thus, one may detect a certain completion in the circumnavigation of the Chinese question, its contours forged in the crucibles of nation building on the frontiers of empire. From diverse local conditions emerged a common global discourse. The South African polemicist Lawrence Neame cogently summarized this thesis in 1907. Neame wrote that Asiatics were a danger to the colonies because they would always underlive and undersell the European, dragging down their wages and beating them at commerce to boot. He perpetuated the coolie fiction that Asians were naturally servile and lacked normal human desires for economic sufficiency and improvement. And he ignored, of course, the historical and political reasons for China and India's impoverishment. But Neame also assumed a more alarmist tone than heard previously. Like the Rand lords who had not anticipated unruly Chinese miners in their minds, Neame noted nervously, quote, an awakening of Asia, a movement which involves a keener resentment than obtained in the old days. There is a vague yet growing sense of commercial power. The idea is gaining ground that a weak spot has been found in the armor of Europe. And here he's referring to the Russo-Japanese War. Neame perceived a contest between the surplus populations of Europe and Asia over control of the temperate zones of the southern hemisphere. Without strict barriers to Asiatic immigration, Neame feared that Europeans would lose this contest, lose by the numbers, lose by the cheapness of servile Asian labor, and in something of a contradiction, lose by the cleverness of Chinese and Indians at business. We should not forget the role of the United States in the coming of the Chinese question. Not only was the coolie trope born on the American far west, but for settler colonials in Australia and South Africa, the post-Civil War United States, that is, the United States of the 14th Amendment, was, broadly speaking, an object lesson in the folly of racial equality, witnessed the consequences of unchecked Chinese immigration and Black Reconstruction. But so then did white America come to its senses and offer solutions in racial management, Chinese exclusion, and Jim Crow segregation. And these solutions inspired the policies of white Australia and segregated South Africa. If the first bricks of the Great Wall against China were laid by the United States, that wall grew and promoted the development of the American West, Australia, and South Africa as so-called white men's countries. So to wrap up, I just want to point to a couple of lessons that we might glean from this travel log. First, it suggests a distinction between prejudice and politics. It makes us think about the role of power in the production of difference. While tensions and conflict existed when Chinese and Euro-Americans first came together during the gold rushes, this alone did not produce Chinese exclusion. The Chinese question as a theory of racial danger and exclusion as state policy emerged as constituent elements of nationalist politics. That was already abloom in the mid-19th century United States in racialized notions of continental expansion and the meanings of free labor. In the British settler colonies, the coolie trope emerged later as a central element of Australian nationalist ambition and the fashioning of the British Dominion. Second, I hope that a more expansive and transnational perspective can help us appreciate the importance of Chinese exclusion as part of a dynamic interplay between Anglo-American expansion and Chinese containment. Imperialism's footprint in China was set down with opium, gunboat diplomacy, unequal treaties, and war indemnities, yes, but also from the exclusion laws. The wall protected and advantaged American and British territorial and economic expansion, which depended on control over land, resources, markets, labor, and not least gold, the foundation of credit. From another angle, the wall also contained China. Free immigration invariably begets commercial and cultural exchange. An open door, yes, but one that swings only one way. That was the strategy of the West. Henceforth, Chinese labor migration and settlement would remain regionally concentrated to Southeast Asia and Manchuria, areas that were also entangled with European and Japanese colonialism. Of course, it could not last forever. After World War II, decolonization loosened the regimes of exclusion, and the end of the Cold War hastened a new era of global economic integration. A different world informs the Chinese question today. Today's anxieties about China's economic power as a new yellow peril are generated by contemporary issues of global economy and politics, but they also draw from a deeper history of ideas and forces that power their circulation and their rise to the status of the global. Thank you very much for your attention.
The floor will be open for questions and responses from Mae. This is a wonderful and exciting lecture this evening, so thank you very much. You are all invited to join us for our reception in the faculty room, which is just behind this stage, across the hallway, at the end of the evening. Mae, you're ready for questions?
Yeah.
So we have 2 microphones, I think, on either aisle. If you have a question for Mae, if you'd step to the microphone and then just tell us your name and state your question, that would be just fine. So maybe I'll start with a question myself, since I don't see anybody up there by the microphones yet. Chinese miners went all over the Anglophone world at the end of the 19th century, but they also went to other parts of the world as well. Chinese coolies, as they were called, coolies, in Peru, were mining guano on islands off the Peruvian coast by the 1840s. Chinese railroad workers were responsible for construction of many of the major railroad lines in the Mexican Northwest and down the Pacific coast. They traveled. Japanese immigrants traveled to Brazil in large numbers at the end of the 19th century. So East Asian immigration was a phenomena that included many other parts of the world and included even the Caribbean. So can you tell us something that might help us to compare the fate of Chinese immigrants in these regions as opposed to the Anglophone world?
Right. The main difference is that the migration of Chinese to what I call the Anglo-American settler colonies was overwhelmingly voluntary migration, whereas the migration of Chinese to the Caribbean plantation colonies, Peru, those were indentured workers. And the migration of indentured workers were both Chinese, but even more so South Asians. Some 2 million South Asians and 500,000 Chinese were basically sent to work on the plantations after the abolition of slavery. They were seen as a replacement labor force. So these, some of them were actually shipped in recycled slave ships, and the conditions were very much akin to slavery. And almost immediately after this trade began, there was the abolitionist societies in England sprang up and said, wait a minute, this is a replay of the same thing. What I'm trying to say is that when white Americans in California accused Chinese of being coolies, just like in South America, they were saying something completely false. And anybody who actually looked at what Chinese were doing, if they looked beyond stereotype, they could see that they were independent prospectors, they worked in small companies, they worked for wages. So this idea of coolieism as a kind of racial characteristic emerges in California, where it didn't really matter what you actually did if you had a contract or if you were an independent worker. You were a coolie. And I think it's this association that uses the association with African slavery, which made it so immediately appealing to white Americans.
Thank you. Over here.
I'm just wondering if you can talk about what the conditions were internally in China that were creating the impetus for such a widespread diaspora, and if you'd also talk about who exactly the people that were leaving China to go to all these places were.
Right, that's a great question. In The 19th century in China, especially, you have a long history of Western, especially British, incursion, the selling of opium as a way to solve Britain's balance of payment problems. China didn't really want to buy very much from the West, so selling opium was a way for Britain to get specie, right, to get hard currency. So these conditions, as well as other conditions, created reasons for a lot of Chinese to leave, impoverishment, but also cycles of drought and famine and other kinds of displacements. What's interesting, this goes back to John's question, is that the people who went to the plantation colonies tended to be the poorest people. Often they were kidnapped or tricked into signing contracts. The Chinese called them little piglets, right, because they were actually often held in things that looked like pens before they were sent off. They were kidnapped and held and then shipped out of Macau to Cuba especially. The Chinese who went to the gold mining regions and to the temperate zones in general were not the poorest people. You didn't have to kidnap anybody to go to California, right, or to Hawaii. These were desired destinations. And people went as immigrants in ways that were very similar to Europeans in the 19th century. They bought their tickets on credit. And this credit system was then later likened by opponents to be a form of bondage. But in fact, they just had a debt and they paid it off. They were not indentures the way they were alleged. But yes, you're absolutely right. The conditions in China, much of which were created by British and other Western imperial incursions, is what prompted these migrations to begin with.
Yes, here.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was struck by your images and wondered what role the press had in the construction of these differences. If you could talk a little bit about how they were disseminated.
That's a really interesting question. There were the photographs did not circulate as widely as the cartoons. The cartoons that I showed you were on popular journals or popular imprints like Harper's Weekly, The Wasp, this kind of thing. And you saw how racialist those caricatures were. People who photographed Chinese were, in California often, and in Australia, were often photographers who were interested in the frontier. They were interested in new settlements. They didn't only photograph Chinese, they photographed all kinds of scenes. And you can find these photographs in the California State Library or in the Victoria State Library, but they did not circulate in the same way that the political cartoons did. And so the cartoons had a tremendous impact in shaping people's perceptions of Chinese character.
Yes.
Thanks very much for the very thought-provoking talk. Particularly with the sort of close readings of these tropes and these caricatures and these newspaper accounts and so on. I was wondering, the one reference to Hindustan and even the phrasing of coolies and so on brings up other figures of migrating laboring bodies in this period. And I was wondering if in these texts and these editorials and so on, was any distinction drawn on racial lines between Chinese labor and Indian labor? I think particularly in the case of South Africa, this might be lucrative, but I don't know whether that was established or talked about at all.
A large number of Indians went to work in South Africa on the sugar plantations in Natal colony, starting in the, I think, 1860s maybe, but in the middle to the late 19th century. And what disturbed a lot of white South Africans was that after their contracts were over, some of them went home, but many of them stayed. And they settled in towns, they became traders and merchants or independent farmers. And so after the South African War, the mine owners wanted to import Asian labor. They first looked at Indian labor, but the Indian government objected to the terms that the South Africans wanted because they already had experience with people settling down after their contracts, and they didn't want that. So they resorted to Chinese labor because they could impose these very strict provisions that they couldn't engage in any other activity other than mine labor, and they had to all return when their contracts were finished. So there was a lot of comparison, mostly in kind of the danger if you let the Asians into South Africa. They will actually outsmart and outsell the whites. This was the kind of running fear. So racism is always, it doesn't make sense, right? It's not logical. So on the one hand, they say they're servile, they're automatons, they're coolies. On the other hand, they say, they're really good at business, and if you don't watch out, they're going to beat all of us. So these don't really go together, but they're talking out of all sides.
Yes.
I was wondering, so what are some of the local responses and resistance from the local communities that you talked about, especially the Chinese diaspora communities at the time in California and also in Australia? And also, what are some of the implications and lessons to be learned in a time today when the Chinese question is resurfacing? I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Well, in California, the Chinese community was very, it grows out of the miners who then go to the cities if they stop mining, but also merchants that come along with the gold rush to sell to the miners. They become the core of the community. And they had very little influence. I mean, they would protest when there were attacks on their people, but they had no political influence, they had no political power. In Australia, they had a little bit more because in Australia, everybody had to have a miner's license, and this was controlled by the colonial government. So Chinese as well as European miners had to have a license. If you had your miner's right, which is what it was called, you also had a right to a small piece of property next to your claim, and you could grow things there. You could build a house. So Chinese were able to accumulate some property in Australia that was much more difficult for at least for miners to do in California. And because the laws were not as, they didn't have anti-miscegenation laws in Australia. So there were some Chinese, not a lot, but there were some who, more than in California, who married Europeans, had families. And looking through the claims registers in Victoria, I was surprised to see small partnerships of 6 to 8 miners having equal shares. And they included both Chinese and whites, by their names. And I thought this was something you would never see in California. 8 men, both Chinese and white, owning a claim together. Excuse me. In South Africa, there was an older Chinese community that was Cantonese that descended from the Cape Colony Chinese. They have a much longer history that's very separate from the gold mining. And some of them had gone to the Rand when the gold was first discovered, but they weren't allowed to mine gold, so they became little merchants. And there was a little Chinese quarter in Johannesburg. When the Chamber of Mines started to recruit mine laborers for the mine program, these Chinese in Johannesburg wrote letters to the press in Guangzhou and said, "Don't come. This is a hellish place if you're not white. Don't come." And in fact, they found it impossible to recruit Chinese from southern China to go to South Africa. It was a combination of messages sent from South African Chinese, but also a growing consciousness among Chinese in southern China against indentured, signing up for indentures. It was much easier to go to, say, Malaysia and work on a short-term contract and then go home when you felt like it. So they had to recruit Chinese from northern China. And interestingly, I can go on and on about this, Herbert Hoover has a hand in this because he was a mining engineer in his first professional career. Being a mining engineer in the 19th century was like the occupation. It was like going to Wall Street today, right? That was the professional pinnacle to achieve for a young man in the late 19th century. So Hoover was a mining engineer, and he worked for a British mining concern in Tianjin, and he hooked up with various local people to help the recruitment of Chinese from northern China to go to South Africa. So the community does have a role, but it depends on the situation, how strong their influence was.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting. I wanted to ask you, in terms of the politics in which these anxieties produced and created, do you find any commonalities in which the American example, as you noted, trickled down to other parts, such as Latin America, Peru, Mexico, and such, in a way in which those governments responded in a similar manner to those anxieties?
There are anti-Asian politics in Mexico and in South America, but they're quite different. Mexico at first welcomed Chinese because they needed labor, and they sometimes argued with the United States over, the regulation of Chinese movement between Mexico and the U.S. And there was a moment during the Mexican Revolution where Mexicans expelled Chinese from northern Mexico, and they ran into the United States looking for refuge. So it's a complicated history. In South America, there were anti-Asian immigration laws, but they were mostly aimed at Japanese. The Chinese in South America tended to be descendants from the coolies who worked on the guano fields or other plantations. And because they did not have strong communities, they tended to intermarry with local women and kind of blend into the local community. But the Japanese who went to South America, often because they were excluded from the United States, so they sought alternate destinations, they were often successful at business, and there were laws excluding them in a number of South American countries.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes.
Hi. Actually, my question is kind of similar to the previous one, in that is it possible that the actual history of the countries at that time in Latin America influenced the way that they reacted to Chinese workers because of their history as actual slaves of the Spaniards?
Slaves of the Spaniards. Well, I mean, if you look at, the example that's coming to my mind is Cuba. Cuba probably was the largest importer of Chinese coolies in the late 19th century. And actually, Cuba imported Chinese labor before the abolition of slavery. And so indentured Chinese and African slaves worked together side by side on sugar plantations. And I don't think the plantation owners necessarily viewed themselves as slaves of Spain, although as they later reach for their own independence, they do take on a rhetoric, right, of wanting to get out from the enslavement of the Spanish Empire. But I don't think there's a connection to how they treated the Chinese. I mean, these are sugar planters who want to have servile or unfree labor to work on their plantations.
Mae, thank you for a fascinating talk and a wonderful evening. The reception is just behind. You are all invited. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for coming tonight.